Hello. I think we picked an interesting filter for this evening, considering I don't feel like doing any makeup again tonight. We are all tucked and safe at home while the roads are a little sketchy. They're a little sketchy. On our way out and about driving around today, there's been multiple accidents of just weird stuff. And then I guess the wrecker trucks are just having a heyday out there with everybody that's just in accidents. So it seemed like a better idea just to kind of hang out here at home, wear pajamas, read a good ghost story. Tonight we are going to be reading from the Valancourt book of Victorian Christmas ghost stories. I have talked about this series quite a few times because there are so many good stories in here. They actually go into a little bit of the history of where the stories came from and how they were originally published, where they were originally published, some of the history around that time. And the one that I picked tonight is an anonymous story. We'll get into that in a little bit. What's really cool about this particular story is it plays on the whole fear of catching fire. And Victorian era, I mean, a lot of these Victorian Christmas ghost stories didn't really catch on here, but some of the things that were going on in Victorian England life was a lot of things that were happening here. They talk about with this particular story, the fear of like catching fire because Victorian garments were highly flammable. And when you're looking at like the time period of this and when all these fires happened, during this particular time, we had the Great Fire of Chicago. New Orleans had burned to the ground twice. Same street. Long story about that particular fire, but because I'm a New Orleans girl, we know about this one. In fact, this particular area in New Orleans has caught fire 3 times. So after this whole time period was done, New Orleans caught fire again. So we have this, Chicago fire here. We're having these New Orleans fires that are happening. And then there's these great fires that are happening in the UK, which is where some of the story and the fear comes from. So tonight we're going to be reading the story called Bring Me a Light. And it's a good one. It's absolutely fabulous. So let me do little flippy things with the camera so we can take a look and dive into tonight's story. Thank you so much for joining us for this. We have one more week after this, and then we'll have to find some other kind of fun to get into. We'll figure something out. There's a whole ton of folklore stories that I have come across just volumes upon volumes of folklore things that we might dive into next. There's some Russian folklore. There's, folklore about, Brujeria. We have a lot of different like Celtic folklore. There's all of these like Viking folklore stuff. So there's so many different myths and legends that we can tap into that we might just transition into right after this. So let's do flippy things and we'll get started, okay? All right. Bring Me a Light. Once a Week was a periodical that the story appeared in January of 1861. Let's see if we can get this little filter thing off here. There we go. Much better. And I'll take the comments away so I can see what I'm doing here. All right, so publishers Bradbury and Evans refused to print Charles Dickens' stories here because of his separation from his, I think, first or second wife that this happened. And they'd found a new editor and they started this publication called Once a Week, which is where the story first appeared. It was a magazine that went out. The story plays on the realistic 19th century fear of death by fire. Between 1848 and 1861, there were nearly 40,000 people in England that were burned alive or scalded to death. And usually reaching the age of 5, girls were 60% more susceptible to death by fire than boys because of the clothing being highly flammable. The danger was also higher for older and more high society women because of the more garments and on garments on top of garments. If you've ever watched any of these reenactments of what it was like to get dressed in these different eras, you'll see that it's kind of crazy. So at this point, they'd started starching the cotton with a fire-resistant chemical when they ironed it to help avoid the flammability. So as we get into the story here. My name is Thomas Winmore, and when I was a young man, I went to spend college vacation with a gentleman in Westmoreland. He had known my father's family and been appointed the trustee of a small estate left to me by my great-aunt, Lady Jane Winmore. At the time I speak of, I was 21, and he was anxious to give up the property into my hands. I accepted his invitation to come down to the old palace and look about me. When I arrived at the nearest point to the said old place to which the Carlisle coach would carry me, I and my portmanteau were put into a little cart, which was the only wheeled thing I could get at the little wayside inn. How far is Winmore? I asked of the tall, grave-looking lad, who had already informed me. So we can move this a little bit better here. Maybe not. There we go. Sorry guys, just trying to get more situated tonight. So how far is it to Winmoreland? I asked of the tall, grave-looking lad, who had already informed me that I could have to horse and cart for $1 a mile. 12 mile 'twould get a mile to the squire. As I looked at the shaggy wild horse, just caught from the moor for the purpose of drawing the cart, I felt doubtful which of us... Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm still trying to get situated in this spot here. Let's raise this up a little. I had ascertained that said road lay over moor and mountain, just the sort that would be on the ground, with which such a steed would gambol away at his own sweet will. I had no desire to be run away with. Is there anyone who can drive me to Mr. Earl's? I asked the tall, grave lad. No, about farther. I was puzzled and was about to ask for an explanation when a tall, strong man, as like the young one might be, came out of the door of the house with his hat on and whip in his hand. He got into the cart and looked at me. Ye munna stand here, sir. We shouldna pass Winmore Hall afore the devil brings the light. But I want something to eat before we start. I've had no dinner. Then ye munna keep your appetite till supper time. I can't get past Winmore lights for na man, no horse either. Get ye up, will ye? Lend the gentleman a hand. Joe did as he desired and then said, Will ye be home for the night, father? Maybe yes, maybe nah. Lad, take care of the place. In a moment the horse started, and we were rattling over the moor at the rate of 8 miles an hour. Surprise, indignation, and hunger possessed me. Was it possible I had been whirled off dinnerless into this wilderness against my own desire? I say, my good man, my name is Ralph Thirlston. Well then, Mr. Thirlston, I want to get something to eat. Is there any inn between this desert and Mr. Earl's house? Nothing close to Winmore Hall, the old man said with a grin. I suppose I can get something to eat there without being obliged to anybody. It is my own property. Mr. Whirlston glanced at me sharply. Be ye the Mr. lad? I am Mr. Thirlston. My name is Winmore. Master Tom. The same. Do you know anything about me and my old house? Indeed I do. You're the heir. Mr. Earl is your guardian and farms your lands. I know so much myself. I want you to tell me who lives in Winmore Hall now, and whether I can get dinner there, for I'm clem, as you say here. Well, well, it is a sore trial to a young stomach. You must not bear till we get to Mr. Earl's. But surely there is somebody, some old woman or other, who lives in the old house and airs the rooms? Well, indeed there is, but it's not about ghost or devil's spawn of that sort. Well, I'm surprised, Mr. Thirlston, to hear a young man like you talk such nonsense. What like men do you mean? I am, Mr. Winmore, though if I talk nonsense, yet it's just the things I have heard and seen myself that I am speaking of. What have you heard and seen at Winmore Hall? Well, what anybody hears and sees at Winmore, at sunset and moonlight, and what I used to see times and oft when I lived there farming man, from Lady Jane, what I'm not curious to see again. So let's get on, Timothy, he added to the horse, or we may chance to come in for a fright. I did not trouble myself about the delay, as he did, but watched him. This man is no fool, I thought. I wonder what strange delusion has got possession of the people about this house of mine. I remembered that Mr. Earl had told me in one of the few letters I had received from him that it was difficult to find a tenant for Winmore Hall. Curiosity took precedence over hunger, and I began to think of how I could best soothe my irritated companion and get him to tell me what he believed. We were back on the road again and going across the shoulder of the great fell, and the sun had just disappeared behind a distant range of similar fells. It left no rosy cloud, no orange streaks in the sky. Black rain clouds spread all over the concave, and in a very few minutes they burst upon us. There was a cold and piercing wind in our teeth, and I felt my spirits rise. The vast, monotonous moor, the threatening sky, and the fierce, rushing blast for something for me sublime and invigorating. I looked round at the new range of moorland which had gradually commanding as we rounded the hill. I like this wild place, Mr. Thirlston, I said. Wild enough. 'Tis college learning and a deal better than such house and land. Beggars won't live in it, though. And the land is the poorest in all of England. Well, is that the house yonder on the right? That's no house, good or bad, to be seen from this, he replied. But I observed that he did not turn his head in the direction I had indicated. He kept a lookout straight between the horse's cart. I, on the contrary, never took my eyes off the gray building that we were approaching. Nearer and nearer we came, I saw that there was a sort of large garden or pleasure ground enclosed around the house, and that the road ran past a part of this enclosure and also past a large open-worked iron gate, which was the chief entrance. Very desolate, cold, and inhospitable looked at this old house of mine. Wild and tangled looked the garden. The tall, smokeless chimneys were numerous, and stood up white against the blackness of the sky. The windows, more numerous still, looked black in contrast with the whitish-gray stone of the walls. Just as we entered the shadow cast by the trees of the shrubbery, our horse snorted and sprang several yards from the enclosure. Now for it. It's your fault for running away and bringing us late, muttered Ralph Thirlston, grasping the reins and standing up to get a better hold of the horse. Timothy now stood still, and to my surprise he was trembling in every limb and shaking with terror. Something has frightened the horse. I shall just go and see what it is, and was about to jump down when I felt Ralph Thirlston's great hand on my arm. It was a powerful grip. For the love of God, lad, stay where ye are. It's just here that my brother met his death, from doing what you want to do now. What? For walking up to that fence and seeing what trifle frightened the skittish horse? And I looked at the fence intently. There was nothing to be seen but a straggling bough of an elder bush, which had forced its way through the chink in the rotten wood, and was waving in the wind. Finding that the man was really frightened as well as the horse, I humored him, and he held my arm. There is no need for anyone to go closer to see the cause of poor Timothy's fear. If you will look, Mr. Thirlston, you'll see what it is, I said, laughing. Nah, lad. I'm not going to turn my face towards the devil and his works. Lord, have mercy upon us. Christ, have mercy upon us. Our Father who art in heaven, as he repeated the whole prayer with emphasis, slowness, and with his eyes closed. I sat still, an amazed witness of his state of mind. When he had said amen, he opened his eyes and looked down at the horse, who had seemed to have recovered. As I judged by putting his head down to gaze, he gave a low whistle, and tightening the reins once more, Timothy allowed himself to be driven forward. Thirlston kept his face away from the enclosure on his right hand, and looked steadily at Timothy. I gave another glance towards the innocent elder bough, but what was my astonishment to see where had been, or seems it had been, the figure of a man with a drawn sword in hand. "Stop, Thirlston, stop!" I cried. "This is somebody there. I see a man with a sword. Look, turn back. I'll soon see what he is doing there." No. Never turn your back to meet the devil when you have once got past him, as Thirlston drove on rapidly. "But he may overtake you," I cried, laughing, but as I looked back, I saw the pursuit was not intended, for the figure I had seen was gone. "Well, I'll pay a visit to the devil tomorrow," I added. "I shall not harbor such a game in my preserves." "Lord's sake, don't talk like that, Mr. Wainmore. We're just coming up to the gate. May they be thy strike Timothy dead." They? Who? Not the ghost, surely. "Why, Mr. Thirlston, you said no one lived in the old hall. Look, there are lights in the windows." I thought you could see them," he said in a terrified whisper, without turning his head. "Why, look at them yourself," I cried, pointing to the house. "God forbid," he exclaimed, and he gave Timothy a stroke with the whip that sent him flying past the rest of the garden of the hall. Our ground rose again. In a few minutes, a good view of the place was obtained. I looked back at it with vivid interest. No lights were to be seen now. No moving thing. The black windows contrasted the gray walls, the gray chimneys with the black clouds as they first appeared to me. The moon now rose above a dark hill on our left. Thirlston allowed Timothy to slacken his speed, and turning around his head, he looked back at Winmore Hall. "We are safe enough now. The only dangerous time is betwixt sunset and moonrise, when people are passing close to the accursed old place." About a mile further, the barking of a house dog indicated that we were approaching Mr. Earle's. The driver stopped at a small wicket gate leading into shrubbery and got down, and invited me to do the same. He then fastened Timothy to the gate-post. The garden and the house have nothing to do with my present tale, and they're far too dear to me to be flung into an episodical adornment. They form the scenery of the romantic part of my own life, for Miss Earle became my wife a few years after this first visit to Winmore. I saw her that evening, and forgot Ralph Thirlston. The old hall, its ghost, the mysterious lights. However, the next morning I was forced back to this workaday world in her father's study. There I heard Mr. Earle's account of my property. All the land was farmed by himself, except for the few acres around the hall, which no one would take because it was not worth a tillage, and because of the evil name of the house itself. "I suppose you know why no tenant can be found for the hall," said Ralph Thirlston. Drove you over?" "Yes," I said, smiling, "but I could get no rational account from him. what is this nonsense about ghosts and lights? Who lives in the hall? No one, my good fellow. Why, you would not get the stoutest man in the parish, and that's Thirlston, to go into that house after sunset, much less live in it. But I've seen the lights in some of the windows myself. So have I, he replied. Do you mean to say that no human beings make use of the house in virtue of the superstition about it? Tricks of this kind are not uncommon. Well, at the risk of seeming foolish in your eyes, I must reply that I believe no human beings now living have any hand in the operations which go into Winmore Hall. Mr. Earl looked perfectly grave as he said this. I saw a man with a sword in his hand start from a part of the fence. I think he frightened the horse. I, too, have seen the figure you speak of, but I do not think it is a living man. Well, what do you suppose it to be? I asked in amazement, for Mr. Earl was no ignorant or weak-minded person. He had already impressed me with a real respect for character and intellect. He smiled at my impetuous tone. I live apart from what is called the world, said he. Grace and I are not polite enough to think everything which we cannot account for either impossible or ridiculous. 10 years ago, I myself was a new resident in this country, and wishing to improve your property, I determined to occupy the old house myself. I had prepared it for my family. No mechanic would work about the place after sunset. However, I brought all my servants from a distance and took care that they should have no intercourse with any neighbor for 3 days. On the third evening, they all came to me and said that they must leave the next morning, all but Grace's nurse, who had been her mother's attendant and was attached to the family. She told me that she did not think safe for a child to remain another night, and I must give her permission to take her away. What did you do? I asked for some account of the things that had frightened them, of course, and I for some wild and exaggerated tales, but the main phenomenon related were what I myself had seen and heard, and which I was fully determined, as they were not, to see and hear again, or to let my child have a chance of encountering. I told them so candidly, at the same time declared that it was my belief God's providence or punishments was the work in that old house, and that everything else in creation, and not the devil's mischievous hand. Once more, I made a rigorous search for the secret devices and means of producing the sights and sounds which so many had heard and seen, but without any discovery. And before sunset that afternoon, the hall was cleared of all human occupants. And so it has remained until this day. Will you tell me the things that you saw and heard? No. You'd better see and hear them for yourself. We have plenty of time before sunset. I can show you the whole house, and if your courage holds good, I will leave you there to pass an hour or so between sunset and moonrise. You can come back here when you like, and if you're conditioned to hear and care to hear the story which your peoples your old hall with horrors, I will then tell you. Thank you. Will you lend me a gun and pistol to assist me in my investigations? Surely. And taking down the weapons I had pointed out, he began to examine them. You want them loaded? Well, certainly, and with bullets. I'm not going to play. Mr. Earl loaded both gun and pistols. I will put the latter into my pocket, and we left the room by the window. Grace Earl met us on the moor, riding a shaggy pony. Where are you going so near dinner time? She asked. Mr. Winmore is going to the old hall. And his gun? I want to shoot vermin there. She looked as if she were about to say something eagerly, but checked herself and rode slowly away. I looked after her, wondering what she was going to say. Perhaps she wished to prevent me from going. Presently we stood before the great iron gate at Winmore. Mr. Earl took 2 keys from his pocket. With one he unlocked the gate, and the other he unlocked the chief door. There were no other fastenings. These were very rusty and were moved with difficulty. People don't get in this way, that is clear, I said. The garden was a sad wilderness, and the grass grew on the broad steps which led up to the door. As soon as we had crossed the threshold, I felt the influence of that desolate dwelling creep over my spirits. There was a cold stagnation in the air, a deathly stillness, a murky light in the old rooms that was indescribably depressing. All of the lower windows had their pierced shutters fastened, and cobwebs and dust adorned them plentifully. Yet I could have sworn I saw lights in 2 at least of these lower windows. I said so to my older companion. He replied, "Yes, I was in this very room you saw a light, I dare say. This is the one in which I have seen the lights myself, but I do not wish to spoil my dinner by seeing anything supernatural now. We will leave it, and I will hasten them to the ladies' bedchamber and dressing room, where the apparitions and noises are numerous." I followed him, but cast a glance around the room before I shut the door carefully. It was partly furnished like a library, but on one side of the bed, and beside it an easy-chair. "What name is given to this room? It looks ominous, of some evil deed." "It is called the Squire's Murder Room, by people who know the story connected to it." "Ah, then may I look for a ghost there?" "You will perhaps see one or more if you stay long enough. This way." I followed him along a gallery of first floor to the door of the room. He opened it, and we entered what had apparently been one of the principal bedrooms. It was a regular ladies' chamber of the 17th century, with dark plumes waving on the top of the bed pillars of black oak. The massy toilette, with its oval-looking glass, set in silver and shrouded in old lace. The carved chairs and lofty mantelpiece gave an air of quaint elegance to the dignity of the apartment. I had but little time to examine the objects here, for Mr. Earl had passed on to the inner room, which was reached by ascending a short flight of steps. "Come up here," cried a voice, which did not sound like Mr. Earl. I ran up the steps, and I found him alone in a small room, which contained little else other than a cabinet and 2 great chairs. On one side, a large Parisian looking-glass was fixed on the wall. The branches for light still held some yellow bits of wax candle covered with dust. I joined Mr. Earl, who was looking through the window over a vast expanse of mountainous moorland. "What a great prospect!" I exclaimed. "I like these 2 rooms very much. I shall certainly come and live here." "You shall tell me your opinion about that tomorrow. I must go now," said Mr. Earl. Concealing as much as possible the contempt I felt for his absurd superstition, I accompanied him downstairs again. "Are these the only rooms worth looking at?" I asked. "No. Most of the rooms are good enough for a gentleman's household. The rooms I have shown you, and the passages and staircase which lead from one to another, are the only portions of the house to which you are subject to annoyance. I have slept in both rooms and advise no one to do so." "You had bad dreams?" I asked, with an involuntary smile, and took my gun from my hall table where I had left it. "As you please," said Mr. Earl, smiling also. I stretched out my hand to him, and we stood at the gate together. "Good night," said I. "I think I shall sleep in one of those rooms, and return to you in the morning." Mr. Earl shook his head. "You will be back at my house within 3 hours, Tom Winmore, so au revoir." He strode away over the moor. His fine figure appeared almost gigantic as it moved between me and the setting sun. That does not look like a man who should be prey to weak superstition, any more than good Ralph Thurlston, who drove home alone willingly enough past the same gate and fence at 9 o'clock last night. The witching hour, it seemed, is just after sunset. Well, it wants a quarter of an hour of that now, I continued, thinking silently. There will be time enough for me to explore the garden a little before I return to the house and wait for my evening's entertainment. As I walked through the shrubbery, I recollected the figure I had seen outside the fence on the previous evening. I must find out how that trick is managed, I thought, and if I get a chance, I will certainly wing that ghost. Ascertaining as well as I was able the part of the shrubbery near which I saw the man, I began to search for footsteps or marks of some human ingenuity. I soon discovered the elder bush that had sent some of the branches through the hole in the fence. I crept round it and examined the fence. No plank was loose, though some boughs had grown through the hole. I could see no footstep except my own on the moist, danky leaf mold. I got over the fence and saw no marks outside. Baffled, and yet suspicious, I went back and continued my walk in the course in which I came upon the sundry broken and decayed summer houses and seats. In the tangled flower garden on the southwest side were a few rich blossoms, growing amicably with the wildest weeds. I tore up a great root of hemlock to get a branch of Provence rose, and then seeing the sun had disappeared and below the opposite fell, I pursued my course and arrived again at the broad gravel path leading from the gate to the hall door. Both stood open as I had left them. I lingered on the grass-grown steps to look at the last rays of sun reddening heather on the distant fell. As I leaned on my gun, enjoying the profound stillness of this place, from all the sounds of the village or wood or sea, a stillness that seemed to deepen and deepen into unearthly intensity. The charm was broken by a human voice speaking near me. The tone was hollow and full of agony. "Bring me a light! Bring me a light!" it cried. It was like a sick or dying man, the voice came, and I thought from the room next to me on the right hand of the hall. I rushed into the house and to the door of that room. It was the first in which Mr. Earle had shown me. I remember shutting the door, and it now stood wide open. There was a sound of hurrying footsteps within. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer came. But there passed by me, as it were, in the very doorway, the figure of young, and, as I could see at a glance, very beautiful woman. When she moved onwards, I could not choose but follow, trembling with an indefinable fear, yet borne on a mystic attraction. At the foot of the stairs, she turned on me again, and smiled, and beckoned me with an upraised arm, whereon great jewels flashed in the gloom. I followed her quickly, but could not. I could not overtake her. My limbs, I am not ashamed to say it, shook with strange fear, yet I could not turn back from the following that fair form. Onward she led me, up the stairs and through the gallery to the door of the lady's chamber. There she paused a moment, and again turned her bewitching face, radiant with smiles, upon me, before she disappeared within the dark doorway. I followed into the room, and saw her stand before her antique toilette, and arrange in her bosom a spray of roses, the very spray that I had so lately pulled into the garden, it seemed, and then she kissed her hand to me and glided down the narrow stairs that led to the little room above. Then came a loud, haughty voice, the voice of a woman accustomed to command. It sounded from the little room above, and it could not be the voice of that fair girl. I felt for sure. It said, "Bring me a light. Bring me a light." I shuddered at the sound. I knew not why, but I stood there still. I then saw the figure of an old female servant rise from the chair by one of the windows. She approached the toilet, and there I saw her light 2 tapers, with her breath, it seemed. "Bring me a light," was repeated in an angry tone from the upper room. The old woman passed rapidly to the stairs. Thither I followed in obedience to a sign from her, and mounting the top, saw into the room. The beautiful girl stood in the center, with her costly lace gown sweeping the floor, and her bright curls drooping to the waist. Her back was towards me, but I could see her innocent, sweet face in the great glass. What a lovely face it was. Behind her stood another lady, tall and more majestic, pretended to caress her, but her proud eyes, unseen by the young lady, brightened with triumphant malice. They danced gladly in the light of the taper, which she took from the maid. God of heaven, can a woman look so wicked, I thought? "Watch her," whispered a voice in my ear, a voice that stirred my hair. I did watch her. Would to God that I could forget that vision. She, the woman, the fiend, bent carefully to the floor as though to set right something amiss in the border of the fair bride's robe. I saw her lower the flame of the candle and set fire to the dress of the smiling, trusting girl. I could not move, and she was enveloped in flames, and I heard her wild shrieks mingling with lower demonic laughter of her murderess. I remember suddenly raising the gun in my hand and firing at the horrid apparition, but she just laughed and pointed with mocking gestures to the flames and the writhing figure they enveloped. I ran forward to extinguish them. My arms struck against the wall, and I fell down insensible. When I recovered my senses, I found myself lying on the floor of that little room, with the bright, cold moon looking in on me. I waited without moving, listening for some more of those demon sounds. All was still. I rose, went to the window, and the moon was high in the heaven, and all the great moor seemed light as day. The air of the room was stifling. I turned and fled. Hastily I ran down those steps, quicker yet though the great chamber was out of the gallery. As I began to go down the stairs, I saw a figure coming up. I was now a very coward. Grasping the banister with one hand and feeling the unused pistol with the other, I called out, "Who are you?" And with stupid terror, I fired at the thing without pausing. There was a little cry, a very human one, then a little laugh. "Don't fire any more pistols at me, Mr. Winmore. I am not a ghost." Something in the voice sent blood once more coursing through my veins. "Is it—" I could not utter another word. "It is I, Grace Earle." "What has brought you here?" I said at length, after I had descended the stairs and had seized her hand, that I might feel sure that it was of flesh and blood. "My pony. We began to get uneasy about you, and it is nearly midnight, so Papa and I set off to see what you were doing." "What the devil are you firing at, Winmore?" Mr. Earle said, coming from a search in the lower rooms. "Only at me, Papa," answered his daughter, archly glancing up at my face. "But he's a bad shot, for he didn't hit me." "Thank God," I ejaculated, "Miss Earle. I was mad." "No, only frightened. Look at him, Papa. Mr. Earl looked at me and he took my arm. Why, Winmore, you don't look the better for seeing the spirits of your ancestors. However, I see it is no longer a joking matter with you. You do not wish to take up your abode here immediately? I rattled under the kindly badinage. Let me get out of this horrible place, said I. Mr. Earl led me beyond the gate, and I leaned against it in a state of exhaustion. Here, take your hand at my other pocket pistol. Mr. Earl, as he put a precious flask of the kind to my lips. After the second application of the remedy, I was decidedly better. Miss Earl mounted her pony, and we set off across the moor. I was very silent, and my companions talked a little with each other. My mind was too confused to recollect just then all that I had experienced during my stay at the house. I wished to arrange my thoughts and compose my nerves before I conversed with Mr. Earl on the strange visions of the night. I excused myself to my host and his daughter in the best way I could, and after taking a slice of bread and a glass of water, I went to bed. The next day I arose late, but in my right mind. I was much shocked to think of the cowardly fear which led me to fire a pistol at Miss Earl. I began my interview with my host by uttering some expressions of this feeling, but it was an awkward thing to declare myself a fool and a coward. The less we say about that, the better, said her father gravely. Fear is the strongest human passion, my boy, and will lead us to commit the vilest acts if we let it get the mastery. I acknowledged that I was beside myself with terror at the sights and sounds of that accused house. I was not sane, and at the moment I saw your daughter, I shall never. Winmore, she hopes you will never mention it again. We certainly shall not. Now, if you were disposed to hear the story of your ancestors' evil deeds, I am ready to fulfill the promise that I made you last night. I see you know too much now to think me of a fool for believing my own senses and keeping clear of disagreeable creatures that will not trouble themselves about me. I don't raise the question of what they are or how they exist, nor even whether they exist at all. It is sufficient that they appear, and that by their appearance they put a stop to normal human life. You may be a philosopher, and may have some means of banishing those supernatural horrors. I shall like you nonetheless if you can do what I cannot. I will try. Will you tell the story? Yes, if you will take a cigar with me first. After we had composed ourselves comfortably by the fire in his study, Mr. Earl began. How long ago, I can't exactly find out, but sometime between the Reformation and the Great Rebellion, the Winmores settled this part of the country and owned a large tract of land. They were of gentle blood and most ungentle manners, for they quarrelled with everyone and carried themselves in an insolent fashion to the simply below them and the noble above. The Winmores were iron-handed and iron-hearted, staunch Catholics and staunch Jacobites during the religious and political dissensions of the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th centuries. After the establishment of Protestantism and the reigns of William III and Anne, and the position of the proud house of Winmore was materially altered. The cadets went early into foreign service as soldiers and priests. The firstborn remained at home to keep the blighted dignity. After the establishment of the Hanoverian dynasty, the Winmores of Winmore ceased to take any part in public affairs. They were too proud to farm their own land, and putting trust in the nefarious steward, the Winmore reigned at the Hall when King George II reigned over England, and was compelled to keep up appearances by selling half of the family estate. The Winmores told to Squire, as people called him, was a melancholy man, not much blessed in the matrimonial lottery. His wife, Lady Henrietta Winmore, was the daughter of a poor Catholic earl. Tradition says she was equally beautiful and proud, and I believe it. To return, the couple had only one child, a son. When Lady Henrietta found that her husband was a gentleman of a moping and unenterprising turn of mind, that she could not persuade him to compromise his principles and so find favor with the new government, she devoted herself to the education of her son Graham. As he was a clever boy with strong health and good looks, she determined that he should retrieve the fortunes of the family. She kept him under her own superintendence till he was 10 years of age. She then sent him to Eton with his cousin, the little Earl. He was brought up Protestant, and thus the civil disabilities of the family would be removed. He was early accustomed to the society of all the ranks to be found in a first-class English public school, and his personal gifts as well as his mental excellence helped him win the good opinion of others. Graham came home from Oxford in his 23rd year, a first-class man. Indeed, I exclaimed. I hope I am descended from him, and that his good looks were part of my inheritance. Is there any portrait of this fine young English gentleman of the olden time? A very good one. It is in my daughter's sitting room. We are both struck by the likeness to your grandfather, Graham Winmore. I shall never take a first class, but go on. When Graham returned home after his successes at college, he found his father in a hopeless state, who had his bed brought down to the library because he thought himself too feeble to go up and down the stairs. He showed little emotion at the sight of his son, and seemed to be fast sinking into idiocy. His mother, on the contrary, was radiant with joy, and had made the old ruined house look its best to the welcome heir. For at that time the place was very much dilapidated, and only a small portion was habitable. That is the part you saw yesterday, the south front. And Graham stayed at home for a month or two in repose, after the fatigues of study. One afternoon he rode home from the distant town, and he paused at the top of Winmore Hill, which commands a good view of the hall. The simple bareness of the great hills around, and the antique beauty and the retirement of the hall above all, the sweet, impressive stillness of the place, had often charmed Graham as a boy. Now he gazed with a far stronger feeling of it all. I shall not let it be lost to me and my children, he vowed. I will redeem the mortgage on this house. I will win back every acre of the old Winmore land. Yes, I will work for wealth, but I must lose no time, or my opportunity will be gone. He looked at the ruined part of the house and began to calculate the cost of rebuilding as he hastened forward. As soon as he entered the house, he went on to see his father, whom he had not seen that day. He found him in his bed, with his nurse asleep in the easy chair beside it. His father did not recognize him, and to Graham's mind looked very much changed since the previous day. He left the room in search of his mother, thinking, in spite of his love for her, she neglected her duty as a wife. She should be beside him now, he thought. Still, he framed the best excuse he could for her, for he loved and revered her. She was so strong-minded and so beautiful, and above all, she loved him with such a passionate devotion. He dreaded to tell the resolution he had formed. She was an aristocrat and a woman. She did not understand the mutation of things in the day. She would not believe that the best way to wealth and power was not through the court influence, but through commercial enterprise. He went on to her bedroom, the ladies' chamber, in which you were last night, but she was not there. He was about to retreat when he heard her voice in anger speaking to someone in the dressing room or oratory above. Graham went towards the stairs and was met by an old female servant who was in his mother's confidence and acted as a maid and head nurse to his father. In tears, murmuring, "I cannot bear it. It was you that gave me the draught for him. I will send for a doctor." "A doctor, indeed! He wants no doctor," cried the angry mistress. "And don't talk any more nonsense, my good woman, if you value your place." In her agitation, the woman did not see her young master and hastily leave the room. Astonished at the woman's words, he slowly ascended to the steps into the dressing room. He found his mother standing there. Over a long brocaded petticoat with necklace and bracelets and tiara of diamonds, she looked very handsome, and the great eyes still flashed, and her cheek was still crimson with anger. She turned hastily at her son's foot and was heard on the topmost stair. When she saw who it was, her face softened with a smile. "You here, Graham? I have been wanting you. Read that." He could scarcely take his admiring eyes from the brilliant figure before him as he received the letter. It was addressed to his mother and came from his cousin, the Earl, informing her that he had obtained a certain post under the government for Graham. She kissed him as she sat down after reading the letter. "This is your first step on fortune's ladder, my son. You are sure to rise." "I hope so, mother." "But where are you going decked out in the family's diamonds and lace?" "Have you forgotten? To the ball at the Lord Lieutenant's. You must dress quickly, or we shall be late. Your cousin will be there, and we must thank him for the letter." "Yes, mother, but we must refuse the place. I have other views." Lady Henrietta's brow darkened. "Mother, I have vowed to recover the estate of my ancestors. It will require a large fortune to do this. I cannot get a large fortune by dangling about the court. I'm going to turn merchant." Lady Henrietta glanced at him in amazement. "You, my son, become a merchant? Well, why not, mother? Sons of nobler houses have done so, and I have advantages that few have ever had. Listen, dear mother, I saved the life of a college friend who was drowning. His father is one of the wealthiest merchants in London, in all England. He wrote to tell me that if it suited my views and those of my family, he was ready to receive me at once as a junior partner in his firm. He had learned from his son that I wished to become rich and that I might buy back my ancestral estate. His offer puts in my power to become rich in a comparatively short span of time. I tend to accept his munificent offer." Lady Henrietta's proud bosom swelled, but there was something in her son's tone that made her feel that anger and persuasion were alike vain. After some minutes' silence, she said bitterly, "The world is changed indeed, Graham, if men of gentle blood can become traitors and not lose their gentility." "They can, mother, and I do not think the world can become changed in that particular. A man of gentle blood, who is in very truth a gentleman, cannot lose that distinction in any occupation. Come, good mother, give me a smile. I am about to go forth to win an inheritance. I shall fight with the modern weapons, pen and ledger, instead of sword and shield." At that moment, hasty steps were heard in the chamber below, and a voice called, my lady, come quick, the squire is dying." Mother and son went fast to Mr. Winmore's room. They arrived in time to see the old man die. He pointed at her and cried with his last breath, "She did it! She did it!" Lady Henrietta sat beside his bed and listened to these incoherent words without any outward emotion. She watched the breath leave his body and then closed the eyes herself. But though she kept up so bravely then, she was dangerously ill for several months after her husband's death. and was lovingly tended by her son, an old servant. I must pass over 10 years before the time Graham Winmore had become rich enough to buy back every acre of the land and to build a brand new house 20 times finer than the old one, if he were so minded. But he was by no means so minded. He restored the old house and made it what it was, and made it what it now is. He would not have accepted Chatsworth or Stowe in exchange. The Lady Henrietta lived there still and superintended all the improvements. She'd become reconciled by her son's occupation for the sake of the result in wealth. She entered eagerly into all his plans for the improvement of the property, and she had some of her own to propose. It was autumn of the 10th year of her husband's death, and she was expecting Graham shortly for his yearly visit to the Hall. She sat looking over the papers of importance in her dressing room. The old servant, who seems to have grown no older, sat sewing in the bedroom below, when a housemaid brought in a letter which the old servant immediately took to her mistress. Lady Henrietta opened the letter quickly, for she saw the handwriting was her son's. Perhaps he is coming this week. She thought of the thrill of delight. Yes, he will come to take me to the Lord Lieutenant's ball. He is proud of his mother yet, and I must look my best. But she had not read a dozen words before the expression of her face changed. Surprise darkened into contempt and anger. Anger deepened into rage and hatred. She uttered a sharp cry of pain. The old servant ran to her in alarm, but her mistress had composed herself, though her cheek was livid. "Did your ladyship call me?" "Yes, bring me a light." In this letter, Graham had announced his return home the following week with a wife, a beautiful girl, penniless and without connections of gentility. No word can describe the bitter rage and disappointment of this proud woman. He had a second time thwarted her plans for his welfare, and each time he had outraged her strongest feelings. He had turned merchant, and by his plebeian peddling had bought the land which his ancestors had won at the point of the sword. She had borne that, and she had submitted to help him in his schemes. But receive a beggarly, low-born wench for her daughter-in-law? No, she would never do that. She paced the room with soft, firm steps, like a panther. After a time, thought became clearer, and she saw there was no questioning the willingness to receive her daughter-in-law, but that of her daughter-in-law's willingness to allow her to remain in the house. But it was an awful thing to see the proud woman when she looked that fact fully in the face. She hated her unseen daughter with a cold, keen hate, a remorseless hate born of that terrible sin, pride. But she was not a woman to hate passively. She paced to and fro, turning and returning with savage, stealthy quickness. The day waned and the night began. Her servant came to see if she were wanted and was sent away with a haughty negative. "She is busy with some wicked thought," muttered the old woman. Graham Winmore's bride, as she had said, so good and so lovely that no one ever thought of asking who were her parents. She was also accomplished and elegant in manner. She was in all respects but birth superior to the Duke's daughter whom Lady Henrietta had selected for her son's wife. The beautiful Lillian's father was a music master, and she had given lessons in singing herself. Lady Henrietta had learned this and everything else concerning her young daughter-in-law that could be considered disgraceful in her present station. But she put restraint on her contempt and received her with an outward show of courtesy and stately kindness. Graham believed that for his sake his mother was determined to forget his wife's low origin, and he became easy about the result of their connection after he had seen his mother caress his wife once or twice. He felt so sure that no one could know Lillian and not love her. He was proud and happy to think that two such beautiful women belonged to him. The Lord Lieutenant's ball was expected to be unusually brilliant that year, and Graham was anxious that his wife should be Queen of the Assembly. "I should like her to wear the old lace and jewels, Mother," said Graham. The Lady Henrietta's eyebrows were contracted for a moment, and she shot forth a furtive glance at Lillian, who sat near, playing with the greyhound. If Graham had seen that glance, but her words, he believed. "Certainly, my son. It is quite proper that your wife should wear such magnificent heirlooms. There is no woman of quality in this country that can match them. I am proud to abdicate my knight in her favor. There, Lillian, do you hear? You are to eclipse the Duchess herself." "I will do so, if you wish it," said Lillian, "but I do not think that will amuse me so much as dancing." Balls in those early times began at a reasonable hour. Ladies went to the ball in early November and began to dress by daylight. Lillian had been dressed by her maid, owing a certain sentimental secret between her and her husband. She wore her wedding dress of white Indian muslin instead of the rich brocaded silk petticoat underneath the grand lace robe. The diamonds glittered gaily round her head, and she softly rounded throat and arms. She went to the old library where Graham sat waiting for the ladies. She wanted his opinion concerning her appearance. The legend does not tell how he behaved on this occasion, but it leaves to young husbands to imagine. "You must go to my mother and let her see how lovely you look. Walk first, that I may see how you look behind." So she took from his hand a spray of roses he had gathered, and preceded him from the room, up the stairs to his mother's chamber. She was in the dressing room above. "Go by yourself," said Graham. "I will remain on the stairs and watch you both. I should like to hear what she says when she does not think I hear, for she never praises you much to me, and for fear of increasing my blind adoration, I suppose." Lillian smiled at him and disappeared up the stairs. It was now becoming dark, and as he approached the stairs, a few minutes afterwards, to hear what was said, his mother's voice, in a strange and eager tone, called from above, "Bring me a light! Bring me a light!" Then Graham saw his mother's old servant run quickly from her seat by the window to light a tall taper on the toilet. She carried this up to her mistress, and found Graham on the stair on her return. She grasped his arm and whispered fearfully, "Watch her! Watch her!" And he did watch and saw. "For God's sake, Mr. Earl, don't tell me what he saw, for I saw the same dreadful sight." "I have no doubt you did, and since you say so, and because I have seen myself." We were silent for a few moments, and then I asked if he knew anything more of these people. "Yes, the rest is very well known to everyone who lives within 20 miles. Graham Winmore vowed not to remain under the same roof with his mother after he had seen his wife's blackened corpse. His grief and resentment were quiet and enduring. He would not leave the corpse in the house, but before midnight had it carried to a summer house in the shrubbery where he watched beside it and allowed no one to approach except the old servant who figures in the story. She brought him food and carried his commands to the household. From the day of Lillian's death to the day of her burial in the family vault at Winmore Church, Graham guarded the summer house where his wife lay, with his sword drawn as he walked by night round about. It was known that he would not allow the family's jewels to be taken from the body, and that they were to be buried with it. Some say that he finally took them from the body himself and buried them in the shrubbery, lest the undertakers, tempted by the sight of the jewels on the corpse, might desecrate her tomb afterwards for the sake of stealing them. The opinion is supported by the fact that a portion of the shrubbery is haunted by the apparition of Graham Winmore, in his mourning garments, with a drawn sword in hand. "Would you advise me to institute a search for those old jewels?" I asked, smiling. "I would, but take no one in your confidence." Tom Winmore: "You may raise a laugh against you if you are unsuccessful, and if you find them and take them away," "Which I certainly should do," I interrupted, "you will raise a popular outcry against you. The superstitious people believe that you will have outraged the ghost of your great-grandfather, who will become mischievous in consequence." I saw the prudence of this remark, and it was agreed between us that we should do all the digging ourselves, unknown to anyone. I then asked how it was I was descended from this unfortunate gentleman. Mr. Earle's story continued thus. After his wife's funeral, Graham Winmore did not return to the Hall, but he went away to the south, never came here again, not even to visit his mother on her deathbed, a year after. In a few years he married again and had sons and daughters. To a Jane by our neighbors, Jane Winmore, who always called Letty Jane. He left the house and lands. He did not care to keep it in the family. She might leave it to a stranger or sell it if she pleased, but it was but a small portion of Graham Winmore's property, as you must know. She, however, this Letty Jane, took a great fancy of the old place. She is said to have lived on terms of familiarity with the ghost of the grandmother, and still more affectionately of her father's first wife. She heard nothing of the buried jewels and saw nothing of her own father's ghost during his lifetime. The part of the story did not come to light until after the death of Graham Winmore, when the Letty Jane herself was startling one evening in the shrubbery by meeting the apparition of her father. It is said that she left the property to her youngest nephew's youngest son in obedience to his injunctions during that interview. So that, though unborn at the time, I may consider myself Lord of Winmore Hall by the will of my great-grandfather, I said. Precisely so. I think it an indication that the ghostly power is to die out in your time. The last year of the wicked Lady Henrietta's life was very wretched, as you may suppose. Her besetting and cherished sins brought their own reward, and her crowning crime was avenged without the terror of the law. For it is said that every evening at sunset, the apparition of her murdered daughter-in-law came before her, wearing the dress which she was so dear to the proud woman, and that she was compelled to repeat the cruel act and to hear her screams and farewell curses of her adored son. The servants all left the hall in a fright, and no one lived with the wicked lady except the faithful old servant, Margaret Thirlston, who stayed with her to the last, and followed her to the grave and died soon thereafter. Her son and his wife were sought for by Jane Winmore on her arrival here. She gave them a home and everything they wanted as housekeeper and farm manager of the hall. And at the place of Giles Thirlston, his son Ralph became farm manager in his place. He continued there till Letty's death, when he settled at the little wayside inn which you have seen, which he calls Letty Jane's Gift. I have but little more to say. Mr. Earl and I sought long for the hidden treasure. We found it after reading a letter secreted in the house, addressed to my youngest nephew's youngest son. In the letter, directions were given for recovering the hidden jewels of the family. They were buried outside the garden fence on the open moor, on the very spot where I can swear I saw the figure of the man with the sword, my great-grandfather, Graham Winmore. After I married, we came to live in the South, and I took every means to let my little estate of Winmore. To my regret, the hall has never found a tenant, and it is still without a tenant after all these years. Will any reader of Once a Week make me an offer? They shall have it for cheap. These books, there's 5 of them in this series, and they're all so very good. It's hard not stumbling over some of these old Victorian words here. Hopefully you have some better luck. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we have one more story next week. Have a great evening. Be safe, especially if you're heading out. Have a good night.